Last time I completed the session on changing bodies. And this time I will begin the different types of yoga. The Bhagavad Gita contains integration or a sin criticism of many different philosophies. And while it does that, it also clarifies what is to be rejected, what is to be accepted, and puts forth its own philosophy, which is the central theme of the Bhagavad Gita. And essentially, the Bhagavad Gita is a book which is about dharma. And we must understand that at the time when the Bhagavad Gita was spoken, there was a groundswell of support for religions that were, shall we say, atheistical, that were non-violent, and which were encouraging renunciation of one's duty. And eventually all of this flowered into Jainism and Buddhism. But at the time of the Bhagavad Gita, it was just a groundswell of support for a group of religions which was known as the Shramana philosophy. So the Bhagavad Gita, standing for dharma and wanting to establish dharma, clearly speaks for the performance of one's duty. And therefore, soon after, in the second chapter, when Krishna gives his preamble on Sankhya Yoga and the nature of the soul, Krishna soon begins to speak about in detail an introduction to what we know as Karma Yoga, or the philosophy of work. The philosophy of work today is not unusual, because long after the Bhagavad Gita came, other people also developed their own theory of work. We have the Protestant work ethic, we have the Japanese philosophy of work, but the Bhagavad Gita preceded all these by thousands of years. And not only did it precede it by thousands of years, but it also pointed out that the culmination of all philosophy, the culmination of all spiritual endeavor was to engage in work. If you go to the Bhagavad Gita 12.12, Krishna says to Arjun, creating a clear hierarchy of the different types of yoga. Shreyo hi jnanam abhyasa jnanad dhyanam vishishyate dhyanad sarva karma phalatyagas tyaga chantir anantaram. He says higher than ritual worship is spiritual knowledge. Higher than spiritual knowledge is meditation. Higher than meditation is working in a spirit of renunciation. For by working in a spirit of renunciation, one attains everlasting peace. So, having given an introduction to Sankhya in the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, which talks about the soul, please be very clear that he talks about Sankhya here in the second chapter, not about Vedanta. And the philosophy of Sankhya speaks of individual souls. And Krishna here talks about the individual soul in the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. And having concluded this, he goes on to speak about the importance of doing one's duty. But he doesn't want you to do your duty for the wrong reasons or for the wrong purpose. And therefore, Krishna clearly says that bhoga ishwarya prasaktanam tayaparta chetasam vyavasayatmika buddhi samadhau na vidyate. Don't worship and perform Vedic sacrifice for the sake of enjoyment, for the acquisition of wealth. Because if you're doing this for the sake of worldly enjoyment and wealth, then indeed you will not have the firm determination to follow the path that leads to union with God. So Krishna clearly states that you should do your duty, but don't do your duty for getting the rewards that are promised in the Vedas. And he clearly goes on to say that कर्मण्येवाधिकारस्ते मा फलेषु कदाचन मा कर्म फल हेतुर्भुर्माते संगोस्तु कर्मणि. So clearly Krishna points out in the Bhagavad Gita that you have a right to do your duty. You have a right to perform your prescribed duty. But he warns you are not entitled to the fruits of action. Never consider that you are the doer. Don't think that you are the cause of the results of your activities. Don't think you are the doer. And never be attached to inaction. Never be attached to inaction. So this is a verse which I think every Hindu must be knowing. Karmanyevadikaraste ma phaleshu kadachan ma karma phalaheturdur ma te sangostu akarmani. So the point is, do your duty, but you're not entitled to the fruits. Don't think yourself to be the doer and do not be attached to inaction. Krishna goes on to say in text 48, Yogastha kuru karmani yisangam tyaktva dhananjaya siddhya siddhyo samo bhutva samatvam yoga uchyate. Be steadfast in yoga, O Arjun. Perform your duty and be indifferent by abandoning all attachment to success or failure. For the definition of yoga, the meaning of yoga is equanimity of mind. So if someone asks you what is the definition of yoga, this is the definition. Samatvam yoga uchyate. Equanimity of mind is called yoga. And the Bhagavad Gita repeatedly, constantly reiterates this, that all men, in order to be spiritually situated, must strive to transcend the emotional roller coaster of life and become completely equanimous in temperament. Be invulnerable to all kinds of reactive emotion and maintain and attain that platform where one is completely equanimous. Krishna repeatedly, you will see, tells you to forget about the fruits of that action. He says, Durena hi avaram karma buddhi yoga dhananjaya buddhau sharanam anvicha kripana phala hetavah. O Dhananjaya, O Arjuna, engage yourself in those activities which keep far away from you the small-mindedness of working for fruit. We all work for fruit in the world. In the world, some of us work for physical fruit, which is we work for our income, our salaries. We also work for emotional fruit. We like being part of a team. We like being part of a group. That is your emotional fruit. We work for intellectual fruit. That intellectual fruit is that we desire to become creative and we want to be seen as thought leaders. We work for the fruit of the false ego. We want to be seen as heroes in our working environment. We want to be seen as outperformers. We want to be praised by our colleagues and our seniors. So we work for fruit at the physical level, we work for fruit at the emotional level, and we work for fruit at the intellectual level, and of course we work for fruit at the ego level. But Krishna says in text 49 of the second chapter, Durena hi avaram karma, discard by keeping at a long distance abominable activities that are based on desiring fruit. Durena hi avaram karma, buddhi yoga dhananjaya, buddhau sharanam anvicha, kripana phala hetavah. Don't work in that consciousness that you desire something for your body, for your mind, for your emotions, for your intellect, for your ego. Get rid of all these fruitive desires and surrender fully to that consciousness of the Lord, who is the real doer. Remember, those who want to enjoy the fruits of their work, they are full of small mind and intelligence. Kripana, they are actually misers. More important, Krishna points out that if you are engaged in doing work, you can attain through work salvation. Through work, you can attain liberation. Through work, you can shed the emotional baggage you've been carrying all these centuries, life after life after life. By working in this consciousness, in a spirit of devotion and renunciation, you can get rid of both good and bad karma. Ubhe sukrita duskrite. So Krishna says here, Buddhi yukto jahatiha ubhe sukrita duskrite tasmad yogaya yujyasva yogaha karmashu kaushalam. So a man engaged in this kind of work, devotional service, acting in a spirit of renunciation of the fruits, in an act of devotion to please God, he gets rid of both sukrita and duskrita. He gets rid of doing both good deeds and bad deeds. He becomes akarmic. The work that he does is without karma. The work that he does is yoga, because there are only two things you can engage in the world: karma and yoga. God is the fire, we are the sparks that emerge from the fire, and Prakriti is the smoke that emerges from the fire. The sparks that rush into the smoke are sparks that are engaging and trapped in karma, and those sparks that are free from karma, free from the smoke and prakriti, which strive to enter back into the fire, these are the souls that are engaged in yoga. Therefore, Krishna says, Buddhi yukto jahatiha ube sukrita duskrite tasmad yogaya yujasva yogaha karmashu kayushalam. When you act in this manner, devotion and renunciation, you are free of good and bad, auspicious and inauspicious, good karma, bad karma. Therefore, O Arjun, act in a spirit of yoga, because the art of work, karmashu kaushalam, is yoga. Yoga karmashu kaushalam. The art of doing work is indeed to act in a spirit of devotion and renunciation. And this is not new, Krishna points out. He says that people have always, the wise have always understood this. Karma jam buddhi yukta hi phalam tyakva manishinah janma bandha vinirmukta padam gachantya anamayam. So those wise people who are engaged in renunciation and devotion, renunciation of the fruits, and engaged in service, in work, in devotional service, they take refuge in the Lord. They free themselves from the cycle of birth and death. And by renouncing the fruits of the action in the material world, taking refuge in the Lord, they attain that state beyond all miseries. They attain that state which is known as Stita Prajna. That is the stage which is in fact that final stage, which is the end point of being Jivan Mukta. So Krishna very clearly points out in the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita that yes, knowledge, you must have knowledge, which is Sankhya Yoga. But also, he points out that more important than that is that you should be engaged in work. In the beginning of the Yoga Vashisht, the question is asked, which is more important, knowledge or work? And the answer given by the sage is that work, knowledge and work, they are like the two wings of a bird. And the two wings of the bird carry the bird aloft and take him towards God. So also, every individual must possess knowledge, but that knowledge should not be devoid of work. The individual should not be free or attached to inaction. He should not be free from work. He should not be attached to inaction. By being situated in knowledge and simultaneously being engaged in work in a spirit of renunciation of the fruits and devotion to God, such a person can become free of good and bad karma. And finally, he can be, by taking shelter of God, he can learn to transcend this world, transcend this cycle of birth and death, become free from this world which is a place of misery, this dukhalayam ashashvatam, this anityam asukham lokam, this world which is janma mrityu jara vyadhi dukkha doshanudarshanam. You can become free from this place of misery where everything is temporary. You can be free from this temporary place where there is no lasting happiness. You can become free from this world where birth and death and old age and disease and fault and misfortune and unhappiness are guaranteed to everybody. Therefore, Krishna says, engage in work, engage in work without desiring the fruits of your labor. Engage in work without considering that I am the doer. Understand that only God is the doer. And actually, God is also indirectly the doer. He is the doer because he acts through Prakriti. And also, he points out that not only you should understand that you are not the doer, but on the grounds that you are not the doer, do not become attached to inaction. You have to engage in action. And to emphasize this, Krishna goes on to describe the necessity of action and the performance of duty in the third chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. So Krishna points out in the third chapter, in the third verse, Sri Bhagavan Uvacha, Lokesmin Vivida Nishta Pura Prokta Mayanaga Jnana Yogena Sankhyanam Karma Yogena Yoginam. And the Supreme Lord said, O sinless Arjuna, I have already explained that there are two classes of men who realize the self. Some are inclined to understand him by empirical philosophical speculation known as Sankhya Yoga, and there are others who are designed to know him through devotion and work, and these people are known as yogis. You have to understand at the time that the Bhagavad Gita was spoken, there were two predominant philosophies. And these two predominant philosophies were exactly opposing one another. One philosophy stated that you must do your duties, you should perform your Vedic karmas and sacrifices, and ultimately, by doing your duty and performing your karmas and sacrifices, you will attain Swarg or heavenly planets, and from there you will be reborn into a family which is far more aristocratic, far more prosperous, so that you will have wealth and a family where you will acquire their genes of physical beauty and the tradition of cultivating knowledge. But Krishna says that is not the path you should follow. You should do your duty, certainly perform your actions. You should certainly perform your Vedic karmas as well. But Krishna says, do it as a sacrifice, do it as a yajna, do it for me, do it for God. The other group of people believed that performing one's duty entangled you within the world, and therefore keep apart from the world. Abandon your family, your wife, your children, abandon your relatives, abandon society. Take refuge in the forest, take refuge in the mountains, and there engage in philosophical speculation on Sankhya. Understand what the world is composed of, and in this practice, you will attain freedom from the cycle of birth and death. So, Krishna brought about in the Bhagavad Gita an integration between Sankhya and Yoga. He explained how you have to perform knowledge and work as the two wings of a bird that carry you towards God. So he said, yes, you must have knowledge, you must be established in knowledge. But while you are established in knowledge, do not abstain from your duty, do not renounce externally anything. Renunciation is indeed something that is internal, not external. External renunciation, Krishna points out, is to be avoided. So Krishna has pointed out in the 3rd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita that there are 2 types of people in the world currently when he spoke the Bhagavad Gita. Jnana yogena sankhyanam, karma yogena yoginam. But Krishna is going to explain how one can have knowledge, have inner renunciation, and yet remain within the world in a spirit of dedication to God and renunciation mentally from the things of the world. So Krishna points out to Arjun, na karmanam anarambham naishkarmyam purusho ashnute na cha sannyasana deva siddhim samadhi gacchati. Don't think that by renouncing the world you will attain freedom from karma. Don't think that by abstaining from work, by giving up your duty, you will become free from reaction. Do not think that by renouncing externally, you will suddenly attain moksha or mukti. Indeed, by renouncing alone, you cannot attain perfection. Krishna has pointed out later in the Bhagavad Gita that Krishna clearly declares Sannyasas karma yogascha nihashreyasya karavubhau tayostu karma sannyasat karma yogo vishishyate. There is the path of external renunciation and there is the path of working with devotion. Sannyasas karma yogascha nihashreyasya karavubhau tayostu karma sannyasat karma yogo vishishyate. Indeed, you can give up your job, your family, and you can shave your head, wear orange robes. That is the path of sannyasa, external renunciation. Or you can continue to remain where you are, renouncing the world internally, but engaging in service, in performance of duty, in pleasing the world, in pleasing your family. And he says, between the two, working in a spirit of devotion and renunciation is by far superior. And Krishna points out also, Sanyasastu mahabhao dukkham aptum yogatah yoga yukta munir brahma na chirena adhigacchati. O mighty armed one, Mahabhao, the path of sannyas without having attained union with God, renouncing the world externally without having attained union with God, is a path full of sorrow. Dukkham aptuma yogata. Krishna guarantees that if you leave the world, if you abandon the world, without having attained union with God, then you are guaranteed sorrow. But if you work in the world in a spirit of renunciation and devotion to God, renunciation of the world and devotion to God, then Krishna says, you will attain the supreme without delay. Working in a spirit of renunciation of the world, in a spirit of devotion to God, you will attain the supreme without delay. So Krishna says here in the 3rd chapter, 4th text, by giving up your work, you will not become free from karma, nor by giving up alone, giving up the world alone, will you attain any sort of perfection or moksha or mukti. Indeed, he says, you have no choice but to engage in work. Absolutely no choice. Nahi kaschid shanamapi jatu tistatya karmakrit. Karyate hi avashya karma. Sarva prakriti jan guna. All men are forced to act helplessly according to the impulses born of the modes of material nature, born of the gunas of prakriti, of which your physical body and subtle body is composed. You cannot but help to act, cannot help acting. You have to do something or the other. Not a single moment you can remain without physical or mental activity. This is the nature of Prakriti. So Krishna explains that to him. Therefore, Krishna says, don't be a hypocrite. Karma indriyani samyamya ya aste manasa smaran indriya arthan vimudatma mithyachara sa uchyate. So one who physically restrains the senses and the organs of action. You can close your eyes, shut your ears, keep your mouth shut, keep your tongue within, don't touch anything, and yet your mind may be engaged on all the wonderful things that attract the senses. So such a person, Krishna says, is mithyachara sa uchyate. He is in fact a hypocrite. And then Krishna gives his recommendation. Yastva indriyani manasa niyamya aravate arjuna karma indriye karma yogam asaktasa vishishyate. But one who controls the senses by the mind, not physically, but he controls the senses internally by his mind, who engages his active organs, his hands, his legs, his mind, he engages them in works of devotion without attachment. Such a person, Krishna explains, who acts in karma yoga is by far superior. In fact, Krishna says you cannot even maintain your body without work. So Krishna says, Sharira yatrapi chate na prasiddhyeda karmanaha. A man cannot even maintain his physical body without work. So you must work. But how do you work? This is the secret that is given by Krishna. And this is given in the 9th text of the 3rd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says, when you work, don't work for self. When you work, don't work for foolish things of the world. Don't work for rewards. Don't work for physical fruit, mental fruit, intellectual fruit, ego fruit. He says, when you act in the world, act in a spirit of sacrifice, act in a spirit of devotion to God, act in a spirit of sacrifice. See, if you ever sat for a Vedic yajna, you will see that you put ghee into the fire, you put samagri into the fire, and each time you say, idam agnaya, idam na mama, idam indraya, idam na mama, idam krishnaya, idam na mama. This is meant for you, God. It is not meant for me. So also when you perform your work in that spirit of sacrifice, with that idea, idam na mama, if indeed you can look upon your work as a sacrifice, if indeed you can look upon your work and think, believe, and mentally offer that work to God, then that work which you offer to God with the idea idam na mama, that work is indeed what we call as yajna, and that is free from karma. All other action you perform is indeed karma. So I'm giving you now a practical tip on what you should do. Before you start your work, before you pick up the phone and make a call, before you send an email, before you engage in any form of work, my friends, close your eyes. Imagine the feet of Bhagavan Krishna and offer that action as a flower that you are offering at his feet. That, hey Bhagavan, idam Krishnaya, idam namama, and offer that action as a flower at his feet. At the end of the day, my friends, pick up every single flower that has been offered at his feet through the day. Sit down, go through all the actions you offered as flowers at Krishna's feet. Pick up all those flowers, make them into a garland, and put that garland around the neck of Krishna. And when you put that garland around the neck of Krishna, you will feel a transformation occurring within you. The heavier that garland, the lighter your heart. The lighter that garland, my friends, the heavier your heart. So therefore, all actions must be performed as an act of devotion to God without seeking the fruits of this world. And it's see everything as work, not just the work you do in your office. Krishna says, Yat karoshi yad ashnasi yat juhosi dadasi yat tapasyasi kaunteya tad kurushvam adarpanam. Whatever work you do, whatever you offer, whatever you give away, whatever charities, whatever austerities you perform, everything, Krishna says, do it for me. And when you do things in the world as a flower offered at his feet, those actions will be free from good and bad karma. Ubhe sukrita duskrite. And this, Krishna says, Tasmad yogaya yujasva yogaha karmashu kaushalam. This is the art of doing work. The art of doing work is not to seek physical, emotional, intellectual, or ego fruit. You should indeed think of what you're doing as a flower at Krishna's feet. And if you pick up all the flowers at the end of the day that you have offered, and you make them into a garland and put them round the Lord's neck, you will find that the heavier that garland, the lighter your heart, the lighter that garland, the heavier will be your heart. That is the eternal law. That is the law of Karma Yoga in the Bhagavad Gita. I will pause here. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Yes, of course. Good morning, Dr. Nagarkatti. Dr. Shantanu, one of the questions that we've actually just got is would reflex actions which are not done deliberately amount to karma?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. Would reflex actions which are not done deliberately amount to karma?
In fact, reflex actions performed are karma. Because all the thought patterns, all the habit patterns, all the speech patterns, all the reflex actions that emerge are but coming from the storehouse of karma in your subtle body. They're coming from the storehouse of karma in your subtle body. Therefore, when you spontaneously burst into anger, do not think that is free from karma. That is entangling you further with karma, and it is also arising from karma. But when you can find that space between provocation and your response, And in that space between that provocation of that the world puts up and the response that you give, in that space, if you can indeed surrender to God and then let God guide your action. For indeed, Ishvara Sarva Bhutanam Hriday Deshe Arjuna Tishtati Brahmyan Sarva Bhutani Yantrarudani Maya. Somebody provokes you, but before you reflexly reply, you find some time. And in that time which you create, God who is in your heart, He guides you. And He guides you what would be pleasing to Him. And you offer that action, that response as a flower at His feet. And that makes you free. That is a sacrifice.
Um, Great, Dr. Shantu. So, Dr. Nagarkatti spoke about fruits and the fact that you have to engage yourself in spiritual practice and do your actions. So, how do people engage themselves in the mortal world? How do people engage themselves in their actions without thinking about what will it bring them, without thinking about the fruit really?
Of course, they think about the fruit. If the thinking of the fruit is not conscious, it is unconscious. If it is not declared, it is implicit. But everyone who does everything in this world, which is not a sacrifice for God, which is not an act of devotion to God, which is not a flower offered at the feet of Krishna, is done with the expectation of getting fruit, either physical fruit in the form of money, emotional fruit in the form of joy, intellectual fruit in the form of creativity or development of your intellect, ego fruit in the terms of being praised. Everyone who does something which is not a sacrifice for God certainly does it explicitly or implicitly for the fruit.
Right. Great. Thank you. Dr. Shantanu, I want to know, do letting go of, we've spoken about feelings and we've spoken about how, you have to keep constantly thinking about God. Can letting go of feelings like, anger, jealousy, resentment are, and you obviously spoke about internal and external renunciation also. So can letting go of these feelings are signs of, internal renunciation?
See, as you become increasingly absorbed in God, and also as you consequently become increasingly forgetful of self, you will find that you will transcend most reactive emotions.
Right.
This will come naturally.
Mm.
It doesn't require you to fight the emotion, which, as any psychologist will tell you, suppressing and denying emotion will bring it out in other ways.
Mm.
But by offering this emotion to God in a spirit of devotion and renunciation, with a background of philosophy to explain why you're doing it, will help you to transcend emotion. And this transcendence of emotion will come naturally and effectively as you become more attached to God and as you become more detached from the world. Vasudeva Bhagavati Bhakti Yoga Projita Janayati Ashu Vairagyam Jnanam Cha Yadahitam. For one who worships Bhagwan Krishna in the prescribed manner, automatically, spontaneously, effortlessly, naturally, you will become attached from the world and you will become filled with spiritual knowledge.
Right. Thank you. I think we have time to take a couple of questions more. Dr. Shantanu, even though it might come as an oxymoron, and excuse me for, asking this, but is it okay to have material desires in this world while also staying, very spiritual, or the two things cannot exist with each other?
See, in this world, there are legitimate desires and there are illegitimate desires. There are natural desires, and then there are desires that are born out of uncontrolled greed. Natural desires, legitimate desires, you may have, but even those desires must be offered to God. For example, in the Uddhav Gita of the Bhagavad, Uddhav is praying to the Lord and he says, Tvai upabhukta shraga gandha vasho alankara charchita uchishta bhojino dasas tvai mayam jayemahi. He says, Oh Lord, you are so kind that by offering to you before enjoying it, if I offer you beautiful clothes, if I offer you garlands, if I offer you scent and perfumes, if I offer you delicious food, and once you have blessed it, I make use of it and I enjoy it, then indeed I am still protected from illusion. So you have to understand that desires in remembrance of God are wonderful, but desires in forgetfulness of God lead to your destruction. So desires are not desires by themselves. There are desires which make you forget God, and there are desires which are legitimate and which you can have in remembrance of God. So those desires which are in remembrance of God are definitely legitimate. Therefore, there is a prayer, there is a verse which says, Akamo sarva kamo va moksha kamo udaradi tivrena bhakti yogena yajeta purusham param. Whether you have no desires, whether you are full of material desires, whether you have only the desire for moksha, it doesn't matter. Just approach the Supreme Lord, Param Purush, for the fulfillment of these desires, and they will turn harmless.
Thank you. I think we can take one last question. There's some noise coming in the background. If someone is or not on mute, please request them to go on mute. Dr. Shantu, I'll explain a little. We are in the midst of a raging pandemic. A lot of us have either lost someone they know, or friends, family have lost people. So in such a situation, how do you maintain unflinching devotion and faith towards God? Because a lot of people, I speak to a lot of people these days, and generally also they say things like I had so much faith in God and yet this happened. So how do you maintain, of course you have to maintain that faith in God, but how do you maintain faith, unflinching faith, in times like these, such troubled times?
The first thing I would say is that I've already spoken extensively on the law of karma. And I would suggest that those people who find their faith faltering should listen to the 3-4 lectures on the law of karma, not once, but twice, thrice, 4 times, until they clearly understand how the system of karma works. And also understand that indeed in this world, not one blade of grass moves without God's consent. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, it is said, Tena vina tranamapina chalati. Not a blade of grass moves without God's consent. So when we learn to surrender to that to that will of God, we do what is expected from us. And at the same time, while we accomplish all that is within our control, when we learn to surrender to that which is not in our control, then indeed do we find peace, perfection in the supreme destination. People are frightened because of death, but my friends, death is but a change of bodies. It is not the end. It is only a waypoint, a transition point. So if you look at the entire perspective of what is happening today through the window of philosophy, your mind will become calm. If you have no philosophy, if you have no faith in God, if indeed you don't understand the law of karma, if you do not accept that everything in this world happens by the will of God, then you will be disturbed, you will be agitated, you will be filled with anxiety, you will be filled with depression. Indeed, you will be filled with rage when people talk about God. This is the sign of people who have not learned to surrender to God, who have not learned to do their duty, and who have not learned to surrender to God when things are beyond their control.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Shantanu. I think we are out of time. We look forward to the next session. And will you be continuing this
Yes, I
session?
have just begun this philosophy of work,
Mhm.
and I expect to do more on the philosophy of work from the Bhagavad Gita, which is full of the philosophy of work, because the philosophy of work is the ultimate conclusion of spiritual life. The end of spiritual life is not abandoning the world. The end of spiritual life results in being engaged in the world in acts of devotion to God, in the spirit of service. So we will continue this next time.
Sure.
And finally, I will discuss the neuroscience of what is given in Bhagavad Gita about the philosophy of work and why work can be our ultimate salvation, which is being proved by both neuroscience as well as psychology. I will give you practical examples and how you can implement them in your life.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Shantanu, for a lovely session. We look forward to having you aboard next week. And thank you, everyone, for watching. Hari Om.
So, Hari Om, Hari Krishna, Jai Shri Krishna.